Hey, here's our Acts of God Today sermon summary for Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. And in Acts chapter 2, we said this is the moment that we have been waiting for. In fact, it's the moment the disciples have been waiting for since Jesus was taken up to heaven and said that he promised the Holy Spirit would come, this power from on high who would be with them and equip them. And so they've been waiting, and we're told the day came. They were together doing what they had been doing in one place, fellowshipping and praying together. And in verse 2, we get a description. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were seated. And they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on them. And they're filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Believers are left waiting. They're left wondering, what is this power that Jesus is talking about? And one question that this addresses that sometimes we experience and deal with is the question of, how do I overcome feeling powerless and ignored in the life of faith? What makes a difference to transform my faith from something that is uncertain or forced? And how do I overcome these feelings of powerlessness and being insignificant or ignored? The disciples experience this gift from on high, but it transforms them immediately, doesn't it? It allows them to begin to speak in other tongues. And the disciples, a lot of them are Galileans. They aren't exactly known for their cultured or educated lifestyle. They're not known for their privilege. And so the fact that they could do this was not something that came of themselves. It was just undeniably the work of God. And that's exactly what happens. As they experience this, all of a sudden the scene changes from inside this room where they've been hiding to outside. And in verse 5, we find out that there's lots of different people staying in Jerusalem, and they hear them speaking. A crowd begins to gather in bewilderment. And they ask for an explanation. How can we hear these men speaking in our own native tongues? And we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own languages, that we're told what they're speaking about. So the disciples experience this power, but then they begin to speak powerfully about God, the wonders of God. And there's a response from the crowd that sees this. Everybody notices the difference. They are wondering, they are amazed, and some of them are amazed and perplexed. They asked one another, what does this mean? How can they do this? And yet there's another group that instead of being amazed, they're actually frustrated. They make fun of them, and they said they've had too much wine. They dismiss them. In the midst of people maybe dismissing you because of your faith in Jesus, maybe you feeling like nobody even notices that you're a believer, Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, just remind us that God is the one who gives us power and significance. He's the one that gives us the gift of His Spirit to strengthen us, to sustain us, and to evidently do things in us that we're not capable of on our own, and that He's going to use that people will be amazed and drawn to that. Some people may be frustrated and reject that, but in spite of those things, we can overcome feeling powerless and ignored in this life of faith, and we can celebrate and embrace the power of God's Holy Spirit by declaring these things. I am saved. I have experienced God's incredible power. People will notice. And so we can ask Jesus to save us. Make sure that you're saved. We can ask Him to fill us daily with His power. And we can ask God to allow people to see and notice and even inquire of us about our faith. That's really what happens in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13.